There we go. All right, so first thing we want to do today is I'm going to talk about this week's assignments with you. As a reminder, make sure you get last week's assignments turned in. Right now, we're at about a 55% turn-in rate, so 45% of you have not turned in the work that was due last night. Do try to get that in as quickly and as soon as you can, because I just posted this morning 2 more assignments for this week, and like you don't want to keep falling further and further behind. So the first thing I'm going to do, this week's assignments are very similar to last week's assignments. In fact, they are almost identical. Let me just show you what they are really quickly. So the first one, okay, I'm going to share it with you right now. So the first assignment for this week is the Unit 3 review. Again, very similar to the one that you did last week, except this is based off of Unit 3. Okay, and so you have this paper here. Same thing, notice that there are page numbers listed next to each question. Okay, that is where you can find answers to those specific questions. And they will be based on, let me show you. Remember that you have, I also uploaded a reading to go along with Unit 3, so you'll flip through that reading and you'll find the answers to those questions within that reading. So it's the same thing as last week for this. Remember that this is gonna be like a study sheet that you can keep and you can use during your AP exam, okay? You know, so this is going to be something that you're going to want to have access to, okay? So we've done one for Unit 2. We're doing one now for Unit 3, you know, and then eventually we'll have worked our way all the way up to Unit 6 with these review sheets. So that's the first assignment. All right, the second one is, again, there is a DBQ prompt. Here it is right here. So the prompt is to evaluate the extent to which urban centers served as hubs of economic activity between the 12th and 17th century. And then there are 5 documents, just like before. And then what you're doing for this one is this assignment right here. You're still not writing an entire DBQ, so you're still only doing certain steps. When you get to this one, okay, this is asking you to look at the new rubric for this year, which is linked right here. And then you'll see that there are questions for each thing. So you're writing the thesis, you're writing the contextualization, you're coming up with the evidence, and then finally you are attempting to go for your complex understanding, our favorite friend of the unicorn point, okay? So those are the things that you want, that you're going to be doing for this week. Now they're due on Sunday, just like normal. Okay, Sunday night, 11:59. So it's not a whole lot different than anything else that we've done up to this point. Now I saw, Darlene, you raised your hand and your hand is raised. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question right now. You got to unmute your mic first. There you go.
Donna said that it's not letting her into the Zoom.
What's that?
Donna said it's not letting her into the Zoom.
Ask her if her name is Sandra, if she's signed in as that. Is that her?
I think so.
Okay, so that's why. Just tell her we didn't know who she was. Tell her, let's see. Is that her? Did she come in? I just admitted, yep. Donna, is that you? Are we about to get Zoom bombed? I don't know. Chloe, go ahead. You have your hand up, Chloe. What's up?
Is the DBQ assignment practice thing due tomorrow or on Sunday?
No, it's due Sunday. Why? Does it say tomorrow?
I think mine says tomorrow.
If it says tomorrow, that's a mistake. I'll go fix it after class today. Okay, it should be Sunday night, just like normal. Okay.
Thank you.
So if I accidentally put a due date tomorrow, that's my error. After class this morning, I'll go fix it and I'll adjust it back to Sunday night. Okay. Thank you for asking. Okay. Other questions about the assignment, or assignments rather? Okay. So again, if you're one of the people that hasn't turned in last week's work yet, please go ahead and do that fairly quickly. Okay, and make sure you know, that you get that in before you fall further and further behind. Okay, remember that these grades do count for your GPA and for everything else. You know, this is a fourth quarter, just like anything else. Okay, so it does all count. There's nothing different about this. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get to today's lesson. Helen Keller was not lying. She did write a book. She wrote a book about her experiences growing up deaf and blind. So no, Alana, she was not lying. I'm pretty sure that she dictated it to someone else, but the words are hers. Okay, so let's jump ahead to today's lesson. And today we are jumping into Unit 3. Which means today we are talking or beginning to talk about the land-based empires. Okay, so the plan for this week is today we'll talk about Islamic land-based empires, and then we'll move on to belief systems a little bit later this week on Wednesday, and then Friday we'll jump into Europe. Okay, so we'll finish the week talking about Europe's advancement. Okay, and so there are 2 learning objectives for today and for the next couple of days. The first one, of course, is how and why the land-based empires developed and expanded. And then the second one is how did rulers legitimize and consolidate their power? Now, I will tell you that in this lesson, this is a pretty dense lesson. There is a lot of content here. There's going to be a lot of stuff that are going to come up on the slides that I'm not going to discuss simply because there's so much of it. This is a very content-packed lesson. And so I will upload, along with the video, I'll also upload the actual PowerPoint itself so that you can go through and you can read some of this other information at your leisure. Okay, and then you'll also, of course, have the reading for this week's assignment. Okay, so as we continue to move on, okay, in terms of Muslim empires, we're going to focus on 3 of them today, okay? We are going to focus on the Mughals, we're going to focus on the Ottomans, and we're going to focus on the Safavids, okay? So those are going to be our 3 main empires, Muslim land-based empires that we'll focus on today during this time period, okay? All right, so some of the things that we're going to be looking at today, okay, we're going to talk about how the Muslim empires employed a professional military, okay, you know, a truly well-trained and paid military, like the Dev Sherme. Okay, now they were not the only ones that did this. The Japanese did it with their samurai. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about innovations in the tax system, how they taxed their people, okay, and what that looked like specifically. So that's where we're headed today. Now, starting with this map here, this map kind of gives you a clue as to where each of these 3 different Islamic empires were. So the orange area over here that's occupies most of what is now modern-day India, that's the Mughals, okay? The reddish area, okay, that spans 3 different continents, that's the Ottomans, okay? And so you can see that the Ottoman Empire stretches even into North Africa. And then the Safavids are this area here kind of in between that are in purple, okay? Now, of these 3, I would say that the Ottomans, obviously, they were the largest. They were probably the most significant as well because of their role in world trade, okay? All right, so I want to start, okay, by remembering, by kind of focusing on this, okay? If you were going to be an empire during this time period, you pretty much had 2 options. You could either become a sea-based empire, okay, a maritime empire if you were, or you could become a land-based empire. Now, oftentimes you didn't have the ability to make this choice. Geography kind of dictated it for you. But there were a few empires that had the choice. Like if you look back here, the Ottomans certainly could have developed as a maritime empire if they wanted to, okay? And so could the Mughals, okay? and yet both of them ultimately developed as land-based empires. And so when you have the choice, there's a couple of factors to consider. If you're going to develop as a sea-based or a maritime-based empire, you need to make sure that you have a very strong navy. You need to make sure that you're investing heavily into exploration. Okay, you need to make sure that you are establishing colonies. Those are probably the three principal factors, of a sea-based empire. Now, if you're choosing to become a land-based empire, instead of investing in your navy, you're going to invest in the army. You are going to work on expanding territories rather than setting up colonies. So you are just going to simply expand out and make the size of your empire bigger. Okay, so it's going to be much more domestic. Okay, and in a lot of cases, you are going to be more isolationist. The land-based empires were not as involved and not as into world trade as the maritime empires were. Okay, and so you have to keep in mind, okay, a couple of different things here, which is that land-based empires, okay, are still going to be the dominant force within the Middle East and Asia, okay? This is also when you see Russia begin to come about. Were there maritime empires? Absolutely there were, okay? But the dominant force within the Middle East and within Asia are still going to be land-based. Europe is where you're going to see most of your maritime empires, okay? And when we get beyond the year 1450, okay, we commonly refer to these land-based empires, we commonly refer to them as the gunpowder empires, okay? Because the way that they brought, you know, other territories under their control is by using gunpowder to their advantage, okay? And so the land-based empires, you again are often going to hear them called the gunpowder empires. Now, don't misunderstand that though. The maritime empires still used guns, right? They still had cannons, okay? But the gunpowder empires are often going to refer to these land-based empires. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be looking today at the Ottoman, Safavid, and the Mughal empires, okay? These are the three that come first. They're all Muslim, okay? And they represent sort of the golden age of Islam, like we've talked about before. This is going to be the height of Muslim power, okay? These were set up to sort of counter the European influence that was on the rise at the time. And they're very, very powerful, but they're very powerful for a very short period of time. By 1750, they're all beginning to decline, okay? And that is because by 1750, you're really seeing the rise of the maritime or the sea-based empires, okay? And none of these Muslim empires, none of these land-based empires really got too heavily involved in colonization. And by 1750, the big change that you're going to see is a shift away from expanding territory out and a move towards expanding colonies, okay? Setting up colonies. They believed that that was the way to increase your wealth. Remember, by 1750, we're talking about mercantilism extensively. So the idea that your wealth was measured based on your colonies. And obviously, none of these empires had colonies. And so by 1750, they begin to decline in both prestige and in power, okay? And so if we start with the Ottomans, okay? The Ottoman Empire starts out as a very, very small empire, okay, into what at the time was called Anatolia, but it's now modern day Turkey, okay? Now, of the three that we're going to talk about today, the Ottoman Empire is the one that is around the longest. They're not that powerful the whole time, but they are around until World War I, okay? So they're the one of these three that's going to kind of endure the most, okay? They make it into Europe, okay? They make it into Eastern Europe. They get all the way to the city of Vienna, which is the capital of the country of Austria. That's as far as they get. So they are successful in moving into Europe and of course also into North Africa, okay? They were a very diverse empire, religiously, politically, okay? In terms of religion, obviously the vast majority of the people there are Muslim, but there is a sizable Christian population, okay, and there is a smaller minority of a Jewish population. So they are a fairly diverse empire, okay? And for a time, they are extremely powerful, okay? And so again, here is, at the time, this was called Anatolia, but again, as I mentioned to you, you would know this, or you would think of this as modern day Turkey, okay? So the big start for the Ottomans is going to be in the year 1453, okay? Because it's in 1453, and that's sort of a very important year for a number of reasons, okay? This being one of them, the printing press also being another reason. But 1453 is when the Ottomans capture the city of Constantinople, okay? Once they capture Constantinople, that is the end of the Byzantines. Remember that the Byzantines, if you recall from last week, was supposed to be that sort of continuation of the Roman Empire, okay? And they managed to stick around until 1453, when the Ottomans conquer the city of Constantinople. They do rebuild the city, but they change the name, okay? It is now called Istanbul. Now, they reach their height territorially under a leader who you see pictured there on the right by the name of Suleiman the Magnificent, okay? The adjective was his own description. It was not given to him. This was how he described himself, okay? And so he conquers territory very, very rapidly. As you can see, it's all listed there. He makes it as far as Venice. Remember, Venice is in Italy. And so he sets up Venice, okay, as being a potential part of their empire, okay? So again, he's sort of reclaiming a lot of the territory that had once been Roman, okay? Now, they set up a large bureaucracy for the government, very similar to what you see set up in China in terms of having a tribute system. Okay, the problem for the Ottomans, at least early on, is that when Suleiman dies, there's a lot of fighting over who would replace him, okay? There was not a very clear line of succession. So it was not like in Europe where the oldest son would inherit the throne, okay? And so it was not uncommon at the time for his sons to go to war to try to claim the title of sultan, okay? Because that's what the ruler was called at the time. It was called the sultan, okay? And so again, that was not particularly uncommon at that time to see that happen. Now, again, I can't stress enough the importance of the fall of Constantinople, okay, when it becomes renamed as Istanbul. One of the other achievements of the Ottomans, as I mentioned at the very beginning in the objectives, is that they created a full-time, very powerful, and very elite military force called Janissaries, okay? Janissaries were like a paid army, okay? So this was their full-time job. It was not a volunteer service. It was not something where you served a couple years and then you moved on. They were a very, very powerful and very elite military force, okay? Now, if you were a Christian and you lived in the Ottoman Empire, thanks to a system called the devshirme, okay, you had to serve a certain amount of time as a slave of the Sultan. So this is a little bit more restrictive than what the typical Muslim treatment of the Christian was. Okay, remember, prior to this, you simply paid a tax. Now you had to serve a period of time as a slave, okay? And oftentimes you would be drafted into this military, into the Janissaries, okay? They used a lot of guns, they used heavy artilleries, okay? The Janissaries used the weaponry that they possessed to become a real political influence on the Sultan. So essentially, the military was sort of a co-leader of the empire. They were working with the Sultan, making decisions together, okay, because they had become such a powerful military group, okay? And so again, you can't underestimate the importance or the strength and the power that they brought to the empire, because they used the heavy artillery, they were well trained, they were well paid, okay, and they exerted a great deal of influence on the empire. Having said that, however, okay, there were still a lot of economic challenges that faced the Ottoman Empire. Okay, Istanbul is kind of accepted from this. That was an extremely wealthy city that was very much involved in trade. Okay, there was a very, there still is a very important seaport there. There's a very important trade market. All of those things still very, very much exist. Okay, however, by the 17th century, by the middle of the 17th century, the empire starts to come into decline. And it's for the reasons that you've heard about with every other large empire at the time, okay? I mean, this is nothing new. It becomes too big to control, okay? It becomes very hard for the Sultan to have real control over territory that's several thousand miles away, okay? There are peasant revolts because the Sultan tried to tax the peasants too heavily. Okay, the Janissaries are demanding more money. Okay, I mean it's the same things that you hear over and over again. There is nothing new here, and so they are facing the same kinds of challenges. Okay, we have inflation. Okay, you also have, okay, again, taxes going up. Okay. The other thing is that the Ottomans, when they try to trade on the world market, they face a very they face disadvantages. Now, why are they disadvantaged when they go to trade on the world market? Part of it is that they can't reform many of their laws, at least as it relates to taxes. Okay, simply because they were following Muslim law, they were following Sharia law. And so if you know anything about Sharia law, there's very specific rules about who and how you can trade. And so because the Ottomans were trying to follow those rules, they found themselves at a great economic disadvantage compared to some of the other merchants from other parts of the world, okay? So that's another factor that leads into their decline. Now, another thing that happens here, okay, is the split between the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims, okay, which we've again addressed this before too. The vast majority of the people here are going to be Sunni Muslims, but there is still a sizable minority of the Shiite Muslims, okay? You also, obviously, you are going to see, as I mentioned earlier, Christians and Jews living within the Ottoman Empire, okay? There's also going to be Greek Orthodox, okay, Christians. So you have the Catholics, you have the Greek Orthodox. And that really is not so much of a problem within the city of Istanbul, which is a very cosmopolitan, very open, very diverse city, okay? They build a large mosque there, okay, called the Hagia Sophia, which you can see pictured here on the right. It's a beautiful architectural building. It sort of stands at the center of the city, and at the time was a symbol of the city's wealth. And so you are seeing within Constantinople, things are very different from the way that they are in the rest of the empire. You've got a lot of merchants, you've got a lot of artisans, okay, all of that. However, in other parts of the empire, that is not the case, okay? And so the rest of the empire does not progress as quickly as Istanbul does, okay? And that's because, again, the further away from the city that you go, the more conservative the leaders become. And so you have these very, very conservative Muslim religious leaders who are controlling large parts of the empire. And because of that, they are very hesitant to embrace a lot of the technology that does eventually come out of Europe. Okay, now, what is kind of interesting about that and kind of ironic about that is that Europe is only coming up with this technology and these inventions because they have already, stolen, for lack of a better term, ideas from the Muslims and from the Chinese, okay? And we've sort of addressed that multiple times as well. But at this point, Europe is finally progressing, but many of the Ottoman leaders have this very anti-Europe attitude. So much so that they don't want to embrace a lot of the European technology, including the printing press. The printing press comes to the Ottoman Empire by way of Jewish citizens who had been expelled from Spain. If you recall, around 1050, the Jews are expelled from Spain. And so when they start moving east looking for a place to live, and they settle in, at the time, what was the Ottoman Empire, they bring the printing press with them, but the Muslim religious leaders forbid them from printing anything in Turkish or in Arabic, okay? And so that's sort of your kind of overview of the Muslims, of the Ottomans, excuse me, okay? We'll talk now about the Safavids, okay? Now, the Safavids, these are going to be mostly Shiite Muslims, okay? And remember that the Safavid Empire, if you look at the map here, is kind of wedged in between the Ottomans and the Mughals, okay? This is also the empire, again, if you look at the map, okay, you can see that this is an empire which has a lot less access to water, okay? Certainly, they're not bordering an ocean, okay? You've got the Caspian Sea here, you've got the Persian Gulf down here, which does ultimately feed into the Indian Ocean. But this is going to be an example of a land-based empire that is land-based more out of necessity, right, than they are choice. And as I said, these are the more conservative, more religious Muslims, because these are going to be Shiite Muslims, okay? And so this is the group that believes that the only heirs of the religion are actual descendants, okay, of Muhammad, okay? Now, this kind of gives you an idea. This is the Muslim world today, by the way, okay? So this sort of gives you an idea of which places have a Sunni majority and which places have a Shiite majority, okay? And again, okay, remember that the Sunni Muslims tend to be a little bit more open, a little bit more liberal, okay, and a little less religious than the Shia Muslims, okay? And so Iraq, Iran, these are obviously going to be more conservative Muslim countries than, say, Egypt, okay, which is certainly a much more cosmopolitan nation. Okay. All right. So the rivalry that's going to exist between the Ottomans, who were Sunni, and the Safavids, who were Shia. Okay. Part of that rivalry, yes, is about territory, but part of it also is about that split between the Sunni and the Shia. Okay. And so as the Safavids continue to expand their empire to the west, okay, they're eventually going to run into the Ottomans. They're going to run into them. So their territory kind of collides. This once again solidifies the kind of split that is existing between the Sunnis and the Shias, okay? And so where that conflict begins is in what is now modern day Persia, okay, up in the northwest. Yes, this is very much a religious conflict at heart, okay? However, it is also the battle that's going to take place also very nicely illustrates how advantageous and how important gunpowder came to be, okay? The Ottomans win this first initial battle decisively because of the gunpowder, okay? The Safavids are actually massacred here, again, because they don't have the weapons that the Ottomans do. And so, at least initially, anyway, this is an Ottoman victory, okay? The Safavids recover, okay? And they do continue to fight the Ottomans on and off for a couple of centuries after this. And in fact, the conflict between these groups of people, even today, still continues, because it's not so much an empire conflict. It's now a conflict between Sunnis and Shia. So it's two completely different things, okay? But that conflict between these religious groups, you know, continues even today, okay? And so the Safavids, at their peak, okay, we know that the Safavids are able to kind of expand at least a little bit in the north into Russia, okay? They capture, really kidnap is a better word, because they kidnap a lot of these Russian boys and then force them to serve in their military, okay, similar to what the Janissaries did with the Christians. They train them how to use the firearms that they are now possessing, because they realize after getting slaughtered by the Ottomans that they're going to need to use gunpowder. Okay, so they begin training their armies in the use of gunpowder. Okay, they also incidentally begin to bring in Europeans, not to fight with them, but more to train them. Okay, so they bring in these European armies to train them on how to use guns, how to use cannons, how to use artilleries. Okay, they really want to make a real stand with the Ottomans. They don't like the Ottomans, and so they're going to spend a great deal of time trying to fight the Ottomans. Okay, that's going to be their main focus for much of the time. Now, politically speaking, okay, their authority comes because of religious rule. Okay, it comes about because of their military. Despite the fact that they used the Europeans to help them with their military, they still saw them as being infidels, meaning that they saw them as being an enemy that had to be destroyed. So again, a very different attitude with the Shiites than what you see with the Sunnis. Remember, the Sunnis had no problems with the Christians because they saw Christians and Jews as being people of the book. So they had no problem with them. Okay, the Shiites, as you can see here, very, very different story. A lot of the different traditions that come out of this empire are going to be shaped by their political system. Okay, things like having a very large bureaucracy, having very rich and very expensive palaces that are built for the sultans. Okay, these all come out of their political beliefs. Okay, and so they have there is still some kind of infighting that takes place. Okay, you have this group of Turks who are going to challenge, at least early on, challenge the authority of the Shahs. Okay, now these chiefs eventually develop themselves into an elite military group, again similar to how the Janissaries, and they sort of use their status in the military, okay, to kind of gain political power. And so a lot of these groups get appointed to very prestigious government jobs, again, to the point now where they're exercising authority the same way that the Sultan or the Shah might, okay? So how does the Safavid Empire organize themselves? Well, economically, we know that they support trade, okay? And we know that they use their capital city as a way to help facilitate and help support trade. But again, the further inland that you go, the less trade that there was going to be because they became more and more remote. Their signature industry or signature business is going to be the making of carpets, okay? Even to this day, rugs from the Middle East, Persian rugs, are extremely expensive and they're among the best in the world. They also produce silk, but certainly not on the same level as they produced carpet. Okay, that was absolutely going to be their main product. When we talked about earlier this year, when we talked about the silver trade, and we talked about how silver really kind of had a great impact on the world, for the Safavids, that was very negative because their currency became inflated because all of a sudden everybody's trading silver, and so it lost its value. Okay. Now, if we talk about their social structure, okay, very different than the Sunni Ottoman Empire. This is not as cosmopolitan, so they're not as open, they're not as accepting of different groups, okay? This is, again, mostly a Shiite setup here. Most of the people lived, however, outside of the cities in these rural areas and engaged mostly in farming, okay? And you had a great deal of nomads as well who were engaging in pastoralism. Okay, so it's a much less urban civilization than the Ottomans were. This is a much more rural civilization, and even the cities were not particularly liberal, like you see with the Sunni cities in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, culturally, you are looking at a mix of Turkish culture and Persian culture. Okay, there are a lot of Persian traditions, at least as it becomes to poetry and writing and whatnot. Okay, but perhaps their biggest cultural achievement is going to be architecture. Okay, when we talk about the building of mosques and things like that. Okay, But they do not at any point do they engage in the building projects like the Ottomans do. Okay, it's very, very simple. They're very big and they're large buildings, but they're known more for their simplicity, okay, than anything else. Okay. Um, Again, it's still a very, very Muslim city. Okay, and so I'm not going to get into what the full development of their religion is, but there is some mysticism that gets blended in with Islam there. Okay, but again, they very much preach and very much talk about having a very close relationship in terms of mysticism with their God, Allah. Okay, they don't collapse until the 1720s. So a little bit earlier than the Ottomans do, actually much, much earlier than the Ottomans do. And again, it is for the same reason that you're going to see a lot of these other land-based empires begin to fall apart, which is that the sea-based, maritime-based empires begin to become much more dominant, okay? Over in India now, if we shift our focus to the last group, you're going to see kind of the same thing with the Mughals. Okay, keep in mind, once again, where we are. This is going to be what we would consider to be modern day India. Okay, we know, okay, because this is where we left off last time, that much of the Indian continent by 1450 is controlled by the Delhi Sultanate. Okay, and so this is a Muslim group of people in charge of a Hindu country. Okay, and that's a very important distinction. So you have these Muslim leaders who are ruling over a country that is mostly Hindu, okay? And that obviously leads to a lot of religious friction, which you still incidentally see today, okay? There is still that kind of conflict. Officially speaking, the Mughal Empire is founded in 1523 by Babur, okay? He claims that he is a descendant of Genghis Khan. Okay, whether or not that's true, obviously we can't verify that, but he certainly believed and made everybody aware of the fact that he was a descendant of Genghis Khan. Now he probably was, because as we talked about last week, we know that Khan had many, many children and many, many relationships to the point where it's entirely possible that this guy could trace his lineage back to Genghis Khan, okay? And so his invasion of this territory, okay, was motivated by the fact that he at least initially lost his homeland, okay? And he had dreams, Babur did, of living up to the reputation of his ancestors. He wanted to be known for conquering territory. He wanted to be known, you know, for doing all of those things. And he is, and he was successful in capturing Delhi, okay, and then ultimately expanding the empire. Now, the empire reaches its height, okay, both in power and in territory under his leadership, as well as the leadership of his grandson, who's named Akbar, okay? And if you are a Star Wars fan, that name should sound at least somewhat familiar to you. Now, how did they set up the empire? Obviously, it's a very autocratic system, okay, which means there's one person who's calling most of the shots. This is no different than the Ottomans or the Safavids. And the power pretty much comes from having a strong military. There is not a navy, okay? Again, this is true of most of the land-based empires, okay? Unlike the others, though, the Mughals spend a lot of time fighting the Hindus, okay, because they believed that they were infidels. They didn't have a great deal of Christians, and there certainly were no Jews within India at the time, and so the fighting was against the Hindus, okay? Akbar tended to be a bit more tolerant than his grandfather was, and so when he was ruling, he kind of eased off at least a little bit on the persecution of the Hindus. Okay. Akbar also, okay, not only did he ease off on the persecution, but he also tried to give them jobs within the government. Okay, he tried to cooperate with them. Okay, he tried to bring them into the fold, hoping that if they began to marry with the Muslims, that sort of Hinduism would just eventually fade out, because when they married, that they would convert to Islam and then their children would be Muslim. So he encouraged intermarriage, okay, because he saw that, rather than trying to kill them, he saw that as the way to sort of bring them into the fold, okay? He allowed them to build new temples because he thought, at some point they wouldn't be necessary. And then, interestingly enough, and no, that is not a typo, he ordered the Muslims to respect cows, okay? If you know anything about Hindus, you know that by and large, they are mostly vegetarians. They have a great deal of respect for cows, and so they don't kill cows for beef. And so Akbar orders the Muslims to follow that same policy, okay? He taxed them, okay? He certainly taxed them, and he allowed the Hindus to keep their government jobs if they swore allegiance to him and paid their taxes on time. So he was much more open about all of this than his grandfather was, certainly, okay? He generates a lot of revenue with land in exchange for different services that are provided, okay? They're going to be trading mostly cotton, indigo, and then once again, silk. Okay, cotton is the biggie. Indian cotton is very, very renowned, similar to Egyptian cotton. The ships, okay, so he doesn't have a navy, but they do have a lot of trade ships, a lot of merchant ships. These are privately owned ships, so these are not owned by the government. Instead of buying ships for the government, what he does is he hires out these privately owned ships to move goods for him and to jump onto those maritime trading networks. So they don't own any of these ships. They are paying for people to move the goods on their behalf, okay? You are going to see important roles for women here, okay? The wives of the rulers begin to play very key roles in the empire, okay? They are able to convince their husbands of lots of different things. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman's wife convinced Suleiman to execute his oldest son. The reason for that is because his oldest son was the product of a previous marriage. Suleiman's wife wanted her son to become the sultan, so she convinced Suleiman to execute his own son from a previous marriage. Okay, another example in the Safavids, in the Safavid Empire. Okay, one of their rulers' wives became so enraged over a political murder, okay, that in order to kind of calm her down, her husband builds the Taj Mahal for her, okay? I mean, imagine that. Like, you have a wife that's very angry, and so as a way to calm her down, instead of buying her flowers or something, he says, I'm going to build you a temple. And he builds her the Taj Mahal, okay? Speaking of which, there is the Taj. Obviously, it's a major, temple. Still very much exists today, okay? So imagine, ladies, like imagine one day like you having a fight with your spouse, and as a way to calm you down, your spouse says, I'm going to build you a temple, and then this is what you come home to one day. The Taj Mahal still very, very much exists today. It's still a working temple. It's not in the nicest area. I think I showed you the photo of the fact that if you like zoom out, I mean, it's literally surrounded by a garbage dump. Okay, so it's not the nicest area. Now, the culture, other cultural impacts of the Mughals. Okay, they once again, just like the other empires that we've looked at, they are dealing with religious conflict. Okay, their religion, though, is based on a whole lot more than just Islam and one other faith. Like if you look here, okay, their new religion that they try to set up called the Divine Faith. The Divine Faith combines Islam, it combines Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and even Sikh beliefs. So they're trying to set up this faith that sort of mixes all of those different things. It ultimately doesn't work, okay? And basically what happens is traditional Islam really kind of takes over, okay? And so it does ultimately become very traditional Islam with a sprinkling of Hinduism in there as well, okay? Um, Again, I'm not going to go through all this with you. This slide just kind of traces the sort of cultural impact of that move towards Islam and some of the different things that the rulers did. Okay, as the empire begins to weaken, okay, what happens is as because there's a lot of infighting between these groups, okay, because there is a lot of infighting between these groups, they tend to neglect a lot of issues, like the fact that their military is not as large or as powerful as others, the fact that their economy is beginning to fall apart. And as they begin to weaken internally like that, that happens around the same time that the Europeans really begin to strengthen. And so you not only have the Dutch, okay, but you have the British and you have the French who all begin to kind of descend upon India and see this as an opportunity for them to set up colonies there. Okay, and so it really was unfortunate for the Mughals that they were so focused on these internal conflicts amongst each other that caused their empire to become extremely unstable and really makes them very ripe for a European takeover. Okay, so just very briefly, this chart kind of compares and kind of looks at, this is going to be one that you're going to want to look back on when you're doing your work this week, but this kind of in one chart sort of encapsulates the political differences, the economic differences, and the cultural differences between the three groups. So this is something, that you're probably going to want to look back on. All right, so really quickly before we wrap up, our last land-based empire is Songhai. Now, what's different about this one and why I didn't mention it in the beginning is because this one is in Africa. Okay, and so this one is going to encompass literally the African interior here, like you see on the map there. This one is very, very different, and the only reason it becomes significant is because of the gold that is there. Okay, this is the empire that sort of replaces Mali after Mali kind of falls apart. Okay, so Songhai, which again can be spelt, a number of different ways. But this also becomes very significant on the trans-Saharan trade routes. Okay, it becomes a center of commerce for Muslims in Africa, and so this is really where Islam really begins to take hold within Africa. But what's important about this is Islam only takes hold in the cities. In the rural areas, the people still very much hold on to their traditional beliefs. Okay, and so they become very, very wealthy. Okay, and they do adopt. And if you look at the pictures here, you see these are Africans who have converted to Islam. Okay, and who have adopted many of the Islamic style of dress. But again, you still see the syncretism here. Okay, and so you still see African influences here, even after they've converted to Islam. Okay. They get into a conflict with Morocco, okay, who actually invades them in the early part of the 16th century because the Moroccans need access to resources. Okay, they were fighting and they were winning a war against Portugal. And so Portugal is here on the map in green, and this at the time was Morocco. And so the Moroccans wanted to take over Portugal because eventually their goal obviously was to move into Spain and then on into Europe. But they were looking for money, they were looking for resources, and so they turned to Songhai to try to gain, all the different things that they needed. Okay, they were hoping to take over the gold mines, which they could then use to solve all of their financial problems. They do break a number of Muslim rules by attacking a Muslim state. Okay, the Moroccans, however, do win. Okay, because they have much better gunpowder and a lot more artillery. They do destroy 3 important cities within Songhai, and this attack by the Moroccans really causes Songhai to begin to fall apart and then ultimately collapse. Okay, All right, so last thing, this last slide right here, this shows you, and this is something, again, I think you'll want to really look over and really hang on to, because this talks about continuities during this period that we see, and I've listed them all here, and again, we've talked about them, like the split between the Sunnis and the Shias. That is a conflict that does not stop. Okay, the fact that Islam is still the predominant faith in those areas, those are all things that did not change. Those are all continuities. But then if you shift over here, if you shift over here, you have your changes, okay? And so obviously an important change would be the development of Sikhism. Okay, another important change would be the fact that Islam moves into India, okay? So these are all changes. So this chart, again, is probably going to be one that you're going to want to refer to and certainly be familiar with the different continuities and changes. All right, so let's jump back over here. And if anybody has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Any questions about anything I spoke about today? I know that was a lot. I told you this was a content-heavy lesson today. Any questions? Alanis, is that your cat? Oh, no. Okay. Let me take a look at the chat really quickly. Jan's giving away Hershey's Kisses. Oh, yep, Kayla, I agree. Get you a man that builds you a whole ass building when you're upset, right? Yep, I mean, I agree with all these things. Yes. Jan says Hershey's Kisses, take it or leave it. You're not gonna build her a nice building, Jan. You're just gonna give her a Hershey's Kiss. It's disappointing. Joshua's eating an Impossible Whopper. That's great. All right, so any questions about anything? Anything I talked about, questions about your work this week? Oh, good, Jan's now gonna give her a whole temple. Okay, questions, anybody? All right, then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Have a wonderful Monday. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Enjoy your day. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.